Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Mel Underbakke, the Deputy Executive Director of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. We're a registered nonprofit established in 2010. Our mission is to defend civil liberties and freedoms, promote a fair U.S. criminal justice system, and advocate for the rights of political prisoners targeted in the war on terror. This is the fourth of a series of webinars. The first one was the silent victims of the coronavirus, an inside look at U.S. federal prisons. This included a description by Kathy Manley, our legal director, of a current project she's working on, a coronavirus prisoner release project, which involves filing compassionate release motions for some of the political prisoners who are particularly at risk due to age or health issues. The second webinar featured the sons and daughters of the Holy Land Five. These are five very good men who were given draconian sentences for doing charity. The third one looked at the influence of Israel in the U.S. criminal justice system, and this one featured former political prisoner Dr. Sam Yalarian and Miko Peled, author and activist. If you missed any of these videos, they're available to watch on our YouTube channel. And I'd like to introduce our three guests today. Unfortunately, Aliah Ajamoughli of STOPCVE Chicago got ill and will not be able to join us, but we are very thankful that Mary Zirkle was able to step in to represent the Chicago Coalition. Mary is the coordinator of Communities Against Islamophobia with the American Friends Service Committee. And we also have Fatema Ahmad of the Muslim Justice League, and Ikraan Abdurahmān, whose brother was unjustly targeted by the FBI in Minneapolis, which is also one of the early locations for a CVE program. So I want to thank you all for participating. And at the end of this presentations, we will have time for questions. So please, if you're watching, please submit them as they come to you, and then we'll try to answer all of them at the end. Today's webinar is dealing with a very important topic, which is Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE. I think it's particularly important because the Department of Homeland Security has a new $10 million CVE grant program launched under a new name, Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. So what is CVE? I think affected people are well aware of what CVE is, but many other people do not know what it is. So I'd like to start with Fatima, who will give us, if you could introduce yourself, and do a little better job than I did maybe, and give us an overview of CVE and what's happening with the grant program and what you all are doing about it. So Fatima.
Hi, thank you for having me, and Assalamu alaikum. I'm really excited to be here, really excited to, talk about this really important issue. So I'm Fatima with the Muslim Justice League. I'm Executive Director here at MJL, and we're based in Massachusetts. We are a local organization that focuses on community organizing and advocacy for communities whose rights are threatened under the national security state in the US. What that means is Muslims are a frontline community for that, but they're not the only, community impacted by policing and surveillance. And so, our organizing is really about justice by Muslims for everyone. CVE is one of, the main focuses of our work, and that is because Boston was not only a pilot city here in the US, but Massachusetts has been, unfortunately, one of the leading places of CVE programs. So I'm going to walk you all through, really what CVE is, because I know it can be confusing and it can be hard to talk about it and really define, what it means, what it looks like in your communities, and what to do about it. So give me 1 second as I pull up my slides. All right, are you able to see those slides? Perfect. So we're going to start with my favorite activity, which I highly recommend other folks, use this if you're trying to explain what CVE is, which, I'd love to know if any of you have ever felt any of these things. So, have you ever felt isolated, felt distant from your family, or had trouble in either romantic or platonic relationships? Gonna imagine, plenty of folks have gone through that. That's pretty common. Have you ever experienced a desire for political or moral change? I really hope that, today, especially with what we're seeing around the country this week and what is happening to, Black folks in this country, that everyone is experiencing that desire. Many of us, I'm sure, have felt outrage over, foreign policy, or, have political concerns about racism, discrimination, human rights, conflict, foreign occupation. Many of us are clearly involved in social activism or community issues. Then also, have any of you tried to grow facial hair on purpose, worn clothing from, your cultural tradition or background, attended services at your religious community, maybe traveled to countries where, you were part of the religious majority? And then, some of the last ones that as a millennial, these are my favorites. Have you ever failed to achieve your aspirations or experienced unemployment? So I would say if you have, experienced a number of these, then I might ask Mel, to give me a list of the folks who registered for this webinar, and let the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Justice know that, all of you are on a path to radicalization and violent extremism. And I know that might seem absurd, but this is the reality of how CVE functions. It works to, really put out these supposed risk factors and indicators that claim that there's some kind of path to becoming, violent or radical. So, first of all, I want to explain that the idea of like radicalization or extremism, those are relative terms. Those terms are not clearly defined. And of course, they're used in certain ways, just in the same way that terrorism is used. Second of all, this idea that there are factors that clearly lead to violence is not scientifically backed up. And that's not just coming from me, that's actually coming from the people who do CVE. We can, share out links after this, but the Department of Homeland Security just put out a new informational sheet about CVE where, they clarify that having these risk factors, having one or even multiple, does not mean that you will commit an act of violence. So then what's the purpose of using these things to promote this idea that certain people are on a path to violence? Well, who are we talking about, right? Of course, we're not talking about just anybody. Like these types of programs are not applied across the board, right? Because as I said, if they were, plenty of millennials, plenty of people would, identify in that way. But obviously we're talking about, certain communities, first of all, Muslims, but also people of color in general, are being criminalized for being politically active. So when we talk about having political grievances, they're obviously not worried about, say, folks who are showing up to protest against stay-at-home advisories in front of a gym. But, if you are protesting about Palestine, if you're protesting for Black Lives Matter, we can clearly see right now, how folks are treated for that. It also criminalizes people who are experiencing, mental distress and social and psychological issues that, deserve support and should not be criminalized. And of course, it criminalizes just regular old Muslim behaviors, attending Muslim spaces and just exhibiting, just really totally normal Muslim behaviors. But we know that these types of terms, so terrorism, extremism, radicalization, they put this lens on those indicators. So the indicators I showed in the last slide, right, once you have that lens of, hey, these terms, they only really get used for Muslims, right? So it allows these programs to make it really clear without being explicit that this is about Muslims and about people of color. So when you go out and you tell people to look in their communities for people that they think are on a path to violent extremism, this is what, they end up looking for. So I'm going to go over, just a little bit of the history to the present. As Mel said, there's this new iteration called targeted violence and terrorism prevention that we're worried about today. But I want to take a step back first. So really how this started was in the United Kingdom. So, across the ocean. Quite a few years before it started in the US, this same framework really launched there. And in the UK, the main name for it is PREVENT. And it looks, early on in PREVENT, it looked just like what we see with CVE here in the US. So we've had CVE, the launch of it in the pilot cities, Boston, Minneapolis, and Los Angeles was about 5-6 years ago now. But PREVENT is, a good number of years ahead of us in terms of implementation. So with PREVENT and with CVE, what you see at first is funding. Funding is really used as the initial hook to, pull community organizations into this idea and make it seem like it's community-led. If you can dangle money in front of communities who really need and deserve resources, you might find community leaders saying, okay, I'm going to go ahead and apply for this. I'm going to try to not, buy into it completely, but I need $200,000 to continue my, after school tutoring program. And so, they lure in like community organizations in that way. PREVENT has gone far beyond that now in the UK, and that it's actually, a federal mandate there that public workers have to report on radicalization. And when we say public workers, you have to remember that the United Kingdom has public health care and, a much, I think, more robust public infrastructure than the US does. So it's not just, public school teachers, but public nursery providers, public, doctors and mental health professionals. And I really mean it. You should look up the nursery providers who are told that they are inadequate at spotting radicalization in the children that they watch for. So then you have CVE, in the US, which again, it was implemented, about 5 or 6 years ago. It started in a few cities and then greatly expanded around the country. And when we talk about CVE, it's not just about getting money from the Department of Homeland Security. First of all, there's multiple agencies who do CVE. The State Department, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice, which of course oversees the FBI, are all, they all have their own CVE funding and programs. But CVE is also about, having any sort of program that is focused on, again, this debunked idea that certain people are somehow, prone to becoming violent, and that you can spot, them on this path to violence using these indicators. So what you see today is a lot of different manifestations of CVE. So targeted violence and terrorism prevention is really just the new name for CVE. And the Department of Homeland Security has made that clear. If you look at their documentation, they say this is us relaunching CVE. And it looks really similar to what they did in 2016 with, $10 million worth of grants that they're going to give out around the country. Black identity extremism is another really important form of CVE to talk about. These are the same thing. It's not some separate idea. It's, again, this concept that people who are, actually protesting against police brutality and speaking up against the kind of violence that Black people face, that they are violent, even though, again, they're the ones who are standing up to violence. And this is what we see time and time again. It's folks like, us here, these activists who are speaking up against, violence and racial discrimination, and then we're being targeted as if we are the ones who are violent. Another form of it is just, threat assessments, which is becoming, I think, more common on the mental health front, which really, falsely ties mass shootings to folks who have mental health issues, which we know is not actually the cause of that kind of violence. And what it does is further stigmatizes, folks who need mental health support. But all of these different types of assessments, claim to want to help people off of these paths, but really end up, criminalizing people who just, maybe need resources and support, right? And deserve resources and support that is not tied to law enforcement and is not tied to these terrible narratives, right? So a common thing, with us and Muslim youth that we hear is like, I don't deserve money just because I'm seen as a ticking time bomb. Like, that's not why Muslim communities should get funding and support. So, how this really looks, the kinds of impacts that it has and how it functions is, one, it's deputizing certain people. So CVE has a pretty big focus on mental health providers and teachers. So there are a lot of, routes where CVE is training those, service providers in particular who might think that they are being helpful, but they don't know, that what they're doing is actually really beefing up, say, the school to prison pipeline, or further stigmatizing and criminalizing, disabled folks and folks who need mental health support. It also, really gets our own community and religious organizations to buy into, this narrative and this framework and this idea that we are inherently violent and that we have to, do these kinds of programs when we know that that's not the reality, and actually this is not how you address violence. It also, serves to just, continue to justify the overall way that Muslims and other, targeted and marginalized communities are surveilled and policed, right, by expanding this unproven framework and just funneling lots and lots of money into this framework instead of, into things that we actually need, right? So, one common question that we pose to folks in our community organizing is, what would you do if you had $80 million? Instead of the Department of Homeland Security creating this new department of CVE, what could we do with $80 million, right? Especially now, like, there are so many things that, that we could actually be doing that can address, root issues that our communities are facing. So a little bit of what you can do, and I know Mary is going to talk about this more. Hopefully I'm not way over time, and we'll have time for questions too. But first is, help us stop CVE and end TVTP, which again, that's the new acronym, that's CVE 2.0. So one way that you can do that is let your local organizations and law enforcement in particular know that it's not acceptable to apply to these programs. We have lots of resources online that can help you identify, who has done CVE before. So you can go and tell them, hey, don't do this anymore. Like, this is anti-Muslim. Do not participate in this. And, we will be continuing that advocacy. So for folks who are, organizers who want to get more involved, please do reach out to us. Another key thing that you can and should do, and I just have to make sure we say this, is we don't want equal opportunity surveillance. A lot of people hear about CVE and think, well, it should just be applied to white supremacists because they are violent and we should surveil them instead. That is not going to work. It doesn't actually address white supremacy because this program is rooted in white supremacy. And again, the whole science behind it is really not there. So it's just not actually a method of, preventing or addressing violence. Instead, when you include, one or two token groups that claim that they address white supremacy, it just serves as a cover for the programs to continue and, really focus on Muslims and people of color and other marginalized communities. The other really big thing, and this is, not just for Muslims to be thinking about, but we need alternatives. So one is we need alternative funding. It is an issue, right? It is difficult for a lot of, nonprofits and organizations run by people of color to get access to the same kind of funding that other, white-led organizations get. So we need funders to address that. And we also need to, provide for ourselves in some ways and create alternative spaces, free of surveillance. So one of the first tactics of resistance that happened in Minneapolis was that Somali youth said, we don't want these CVE programs. We don't need your CVE tutoring program. And so they created, alternative models where Somali youth could mentor each other and tutor each other outside of, these CVE programs. And that is a really, really important way for, for us to resist. So I will hand it over to Mary next.
Great, thank you so much. And weirdly, the rest of my slide is not there.
I think you have to maybe click through it.
Oh, okay. Maybe you will click through it for me. Why don't you just get all the text up there? Okay, cool. You can go back one. Thank you, Fatima. So hi, everybody. I'm Mary Zirkle, and very honored to be here with you all today. And Fatima, you set me up perfectly to kind of be able to give just sort of Illinois and Chicago as a case study for CVE. So Chicago, or Illinois, the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, there's a typo in there, was the recipient of one of the 2017 CVE grants that were distributed by the Department of Homeland Security. So in Illinois, they, and this is something that we see across the country, CVE is constantly being rebranded, and there are acronyms in every different local municipality in different states they all pick these very cute acronyms. So in Illinois, it was rebranded as the Targeted Violence Prevention Program, or TVPP, not to be confused with TVTP, which is what the new round of grants are. You can go to the next one. Oops, did we lose Fatima? Ah, great, thank you. So the ways that CVE has shown up in Chicago and Illinois are in a few different ways. I can quickly mention the way we've been able to discover CVE in schools, and this was a focus of our organizing for a while. One of our coalition members, and I should mention that the STOPCVE Chicago Coalition is a group of Muslims and allies, we're individuals and organizations that we have been working together for maybe 4 years. And one of our coalition members is Dr. Nicole Wynn, who's a fantastic researcher. And she's been able to help our organizing quite a bit by revealing this very secretive program. The CVE is a program that does not, that tries to morph into all these different acronyms and different methods of surveilling the community. So we were able to find out a few of these different things that were happening in Chicago schools, and we started to train and educate teachers to recognize when they were happening. So some of these things are social media monitoring, threat assessment training, as Fatima mentioned earlier, what's called multidisciplinary intervention teams. So if a young person is deemed to be vulnerable to radicalism, they might off-ramp that person to a team that would include like a social worker, perhaps a mental health care person, whatever the person seems to need. But that team always involves law enforcement too. So sounds good on the surface, but when you realize that it's a way of, again, involving young people who've done nothing wrong, as Fatima said, these are people who've been identified pre-crime through these, very specious indicators, but they do get involved with law enforcement. And then the fourth thing is peer assessment training, and the Don't Be a Puppet curriculum that was created by the FBI, and you can Google it and find it. This was a tool that was developed to help students identify each other as being possibly vulnerable to radicalism. So that was one way. If you go to the next slide. When ICJA, or the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, received the grant, what they ended up doing with their grant money is to create trainings for the community in bystander gatekeeper trainings. And so what we found out, again, through Dr. Wynn's work, is that, and through filing, we filed quite a few Freedom of Information Act requests, and that's one way that we've been able to discover much of this information in our community. But what we realized that they were doing is going around and telling people that, responding to the desire for people, and again, this is right at the beginning of the Trump era, there are hate crimes happening, and so concerned community members are, worried about this, and ICJA was going in and saying, oh, we don't want hate crimes to happen either. Come to our engaged bystander gatekeeper training, and we'll teach you, how to prevent this problem of hate crimes in your community. And what it actually was a CVE program where they were teaching people to look for young people who might be vulnerable to radicalism. And we believe that this particular, in the new round of CVE grants that our coalition is working with, Fatima's the coordinator of our national coalition, and we will be fighting this new round of CVE grants. And they've based many of the ways that they're suggesting folks apply for the grants on different programs from around the country. And this is one of the programs, this bystander gatekeeper idea. So if you move to the next slide. So that iteration of CVE in Chicago, we actually had a coalition victory. We published a report in 2019 called the Suspected and Surveilled, and you can find it on our website. I'll give you that information, where we filed all these FOIA requests, found out exactly what they were doing, and we revealed it to the community, and it caused a little bit of controversy. We had quite a bit of media about it, and the head of that program stepped down, and they effectively ended that iteration of the program. So we saw that as a victory, but we knew that they would be developing further work. So if you move to the next slide. So what they've been doing since then is called the CARE program. And we also just published a report on this about the criminalization of mental health in Illinois. And I'll tell you how to find that report too. And so they've created this CARE program, again, another acronym that sounds, on the surface, you're like, yeah, communities acting to refer and engage. That sounds good. And again, they're trying to, prevent violence and enhance community health and resiliency. It all sounds good on the surface. If you go to the next slide. And just go through till you see the text. Thank you. So in general, what's been happening is that, again, these kind of specious indicators are being used. And what they're doing is they're training mental health professionals to notice and identify these concerning behaviors. And so, again, if you look at these things, sudden change in physical appearance, substance abuse, feelings of hopelessness, us versus them mentality, many people feel these things. And, just because you feel these things, there's like literally no evidence that you will create an act, or that you will, participate in an act of violence. And folks who are going through these things deserve mental health care that's confidential and that's not going to involve them with law enforcement. Is there one more click down there? So, oh, great. Yeah, and so they just don't indicate that somebody may use violence. Go to the last little bit there, I think. So, and people who do feel these things deserve mental health care, rather than being identified as a pre-crime person. Okay, next slide. And so, this is that's a very, we get very in depth into this program in our report. That gives you just kind of an idea of what they're trying to do, but I think it should really concern all of us. I think this week, where we've seen so much evidence of racialized policing and also vigilante policing. We saw last week the white woman, Amy Cooper, calling the police on Christian Cooper, who's the black bird watcher in Central Park. We've seen many examples of these things. So when we see that, behaviors, just everyday behaviors like that, like barbecuing, are interpreted and reported as suspicious activity, we've got to say, hey, do we really want to be mobilizing community members to identify concerning behaviors to prevent targeted violence? Because we can tell just how these things have been applied, how CVE is so targeted clearly at the Muslim community, but also at activists and clearly at the Black community. I think this is something we should all be very troubled by, this program. Next slide. And then again, just because of the week that we're in, I just wanted to, call out the connections between anti-Muslim racism and anti-Blackness. And actually, Aliah alerted me to this, and I think it's a really important piece to just bring up today, that in this book, The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, he talks about the way that Black people were often labeled as schizophrenic as a way to delegitimize their safety concerns. And in the mid 1900s, a marker of schizophrenia was if a Black man changed his Christian name to an Islamic name. And so, we also know, and we look back in history, that many Muslim leaders or followers of Islam were labeled as mentally unstable by the US government in documents detailing their surveillance. So I just think that, again, in this moment of rampant anti-Black police violence, these are really important things. Surveillance is a tool of state violence, and we need to just be conscious of the way that these programs are, who they target, I guess. Next slide. So some of the things that we talk about in our workshops, how do we address this? What can we do about it? We talk about 4 things. One is reframing the problem, just really asking the question, hey, is terrorism really the big issue in our community, or are there other things that should be addressed first? And every time we ask that question, people think there are other things that needed to be addressed first. We need to reconceptualize political violence. So if you say something, is that political violence? Or are you just having a typical human experience? If we look at those indicators, is it right for us to determine that they are the markers of the beginning of political violence? But then we also really try to train people. We have lots of workshops in our community with mental health care workers and with teachers, because they're often being asked to implement these programs, but then also community members who may be participating in a CVE program without even knowing it. So we try to get people to ask the right questions when they are participating in a program that might be CVE. And then the last one that I think is really important, and Fatima touched on this as well, is just the idea of divest and reinvest. This is something that's actually in the Black Lives Matter platform, but that we work on a lot in Chicago, is really trying to say we want to divest of policing, we want to divest from other forms of state violence, and we want to invest in communities. In Chicago, the Chicago police receive $4 million a day out of our city budget. While we've closed over 50 public schools in the last number of years and 6 mental health clinics. And we think if we had the schools and the mental health clinics, that we would be a healthier community instead. Go to the next slide. Yeah, and so I just wanted to give you, this is our email address for STOPCVE Chicago, and the website at the bottom there, STOPCVE.com. That's actually our national coalition website, and there's a Chicago tab there that you can see. Both of these reports are listed there. And I also just wanted to let people know about, again, Dr. Nguyen, who we work with. She just wrote a great book called Suspect Communities, Anti-Muslim Racism and the Domestic War on Terror. So just you might want to check out that resource as well. But thank you so much for including me in this event today.
Okay, thank you, Mary, and thank you, Fatima. Also, it was a very informative presentations. And now we'll turn to Ikraan and get their perspective, her experiences in Minneapolis.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me. I just like to say that Fatima did and Mary did a wonderful job explaining, I think, the subjectivity of really this program and how it connotes that Muslims and people of color are inherently violent. So the CVE here in Minneapolis was launched in 2014, and this is really the eve of my brother's arrest, my brother and his friends who were arrested in the spring of 2015. The original funding came through the sheriff's office in an upwards of $400,000. And this was with the intention that to target every kind of extremist violence with no discrimination. But again, there is no transparency in sharing that information on where, one, the money is going and what kind of groups it's targeting. And we've seen that with the funding and which groups are actually, presenting the funding and given the funding, that it's only been given primarily to the Somali Muslim community. And that, violence and extremism and radicalization is something that is only present in the Somali Muslim community. Around that time, I think it's about 2016, we as a community really led a large resistance against it. And we let our communities know that, that this was basically surveillance masquerading as social engagement. And again, they changed their name, one too many times to count. And I think the current name really is like Building Community Resilience. And, all of this to really further hide their true intentions. I recall a moment back in I believe it was the fall of 2015, really the same year that my brother was arrested. My school principal, and this is back in high school, of the charter school I attended, which was largely a Somali, it was a Somali school, largely a Somali charter school, I should say. He invited our former U.S. attorney and lead prosecutor, Andrew Luger, for a mandated pep rally that all of the students in the school had to attend. There we were introduced to Aliah Ajamoughli, who is a local man funded by CVE who creates cartoons kind of like Simpsons and South Park, with honestly far less pleasing graphics. And he basically came to dissuade us from taking up arms for the Islamic State and other extremist causes by using cartoons. And this was, again, mandated, and I can only really imagine the kind of trauma this inflicts on, young children ranging from middle school to high school, who are, forced to watch, a cartoon behead another cartoon, only to then flash a screen that says, "Don't do this, don't join the Islamic State." Aliah Ajamoughli says in an interview with Associated Press that his target range is from 8 to 16. Like, he literally will target children, will, show children blood being spattered, men being killed, children being killed in the form of cartoon, and somehow that isn't supposed to be traumatizing, and somehow that's supposed to deter people who have some sort of inherent, reason to be violent, from doing violent things or from joining the Islamic State. I know Fatima also briefly mentioned the resistance that we led against CVE and all the other sort of names that they masquerade with. And I think just to kind of reiterate really how deceptive some of these programs do kind of infiltrate our communities with. Initially, at the beginning of this, the majority of our masajid actually were initial recipients of it. And it wasn't until CARE and Young Muslim Collective and Free the Bros and other youth-led resistance groups spoke up about it and started petitions for the organizations and for the mosques to relinquish the funding that they accepted. And alhamdulillah, for in large part, I think that movement was successful. And we continued educating the community and actively calling out any organization that took the funds, and we're working alongside the sheriff's office. I think as it stands, it really hasn't been fully abolished. And in fact, I think a lot of the work that they're doing now is infiltrating really, they are working on, let me take a look here. I think there was a recent meeting that I wasn't able to attend, but a lot of what they're doing now is that they formed a Metro Youth Diversion Center and are working on sort of infiltrating communities and working on doing restorative sort of services in with CVE funding and with the intention to surveil. And I think really just to wrap this up, it's the meticulous sort of targeting of my brother and his friends. It doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen out of thin air. These kind of things start with programs like this that were piloted and really launched in Minneapolis in light of this arrest, and specifically targets those who are either politically active or young, vulnerable Muslims, and to incriminate young Muslims or young men on a basis of obscure signs like the ones that Fatima and Mary mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, and then indict them as terrorists with super long sentences is frankly absolutely ridiculous. And I actually recall another moment where the sort of subjective signs that we're meant to look out for and to be sort of wary of were actually, I think, highlighted in my brother's trials and some of his proceedings, where the judge hired a Danish researcher whose primary focus was about radicalization and rehabilitation, who then did a one-on-one sort of 20-minute assessment with my brother and some members of my family, and then put them on a scale of 1 to 10 about how radicalized they were using some of these interviews. And some of the signs that he mentioned were, for example, one of the young men decided he wasn't going to shake hands with women anymore, and that made him more radical. Or one of the young men decided he wasn't going to listen to vulgar music anymore, and somehow that made him more radical. And so I think we can just kind of see from some of these examples how CVE and the sort of manufacturing of terrorist cases work in tandem, and they aren't two separate things, and they are viciously sort of targeting the Muslim community and Black communities. And I really do hope that, again, we are able to do things to sort of find alternatives to this funding. I know a lot of our communities are obviously communities who haven't been here for too long, can really use the funding or whatever it is that sort of incites them to take some of this funding. And I hope that we can come up with sort of alternatives as communities and lead sort of the resistance against CVE and all the other names it masquerades with.
Thank you, Ikraan.
Yes. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Mary and Fatima. It's a very informative program. I forgot to remind people they can submit questions, but so please submit your questions if you have some. And I'd just like to tell you that a number of the prisoners that we advocate for are mentally ill, and that have been targeted by the FBI because of many of these things, you know, that you've been hearing about. So next week, our webinar is going to deal with that issue. And so let me know, I want to let you know that before I forget. And I know Ikraan, this is it's sort of a tangent, but we were talking earlier about what's going on in Minneapolis now. And I think it's related. Would you like to make any comments about the police killing there and what's going on?
I think what really distresses me the most, and this is probably an inner sort of, community conversation, is, I think a lot of people are focusing on the police brutality and the white supremacy that is so sort of, apparent in this case and really in all the other cases, but completely ignore, and I think conveniently so, the sort of the anti-Blackness in a lot of, Arab communities and Muslim communities that kind of leads to deaths like this. We, see, especially in the case of George Floyd, that it was, Arab, owner of a corner store who called, the cops on George Floyd, and who then subsequently, as he was, really being stepped on and finding, wasn't able to breathe, was then told, oh, he's probably a crackhead, he probably just OD'd. And somehow this is, justification for his killing. And I think it's long overdue that we have these conversations about, out of businessmen and communities going into sort of disenfranchised Black communities and exploiting them, and how this really works in tandem with some of these things that are happening.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking to see if there are questions. There are some videos out that you might want to see, and I think one is a recent one about the Minneapolis cases of Waiting for Mercy, I believe. Am I correct, Ikraan? And I think we're putting the link up on chat, and then in another video, Accept the Call. So if you, the link to that is on chat. Do any of you have any more comments you'd like to make while we're still here?
Fatima, do you want to just let people know a little bit about our campaign around the new CVE grants?
Good idea.
So we are, working to organize against this new CVE structure, which is, overall it's an $80 million department that includes $10 million of grants that are going out. We expect that people who've done CVE previously will likely apply for these grants. As Mary said, the new structure is also sort of modeled on some of those programs. Like the Boston Police Department has a really ridiculous program targeting Somali youth here in Boston, and that became the model for the youth resilience track of this new CVE program. So I think one way that anybody can get involved is having these conversations with your local community about CVE to help people understand what it is and make sure people don't participate, and then holding organizations and institutions accountable if they are applying, which it tends to be law enforcement, honestly, who are applying, and then they partner with potentially local community or based organizations. And then also I think you can just get on social media and share, like, what would you do with this amount of money instead of policing and surveilling people, like what do you actually want to see for your community? Because it's not just about standing up against these programs. It's really about defining what our vision is for our communities and saying what we really want, and what we, actually want to do with that kind of funding. And then, if you're an organizer and you want to get more involved in our coalition work, you can reach out to myself to get more involved.
Thank you. I have a correction. The video about the Minneapolis Somali cases is No History of Violence. We'll put that link up. And I've also got a good question from Shireen. She says, as contact tracing related to COVID seems like it could expand surveillance technology, what are your thoughts on how to balance public health but also prevent against further entrenchment of surveillance?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question. I actually studied biomedical engineering and used to work in healthcare before I became this other person that you see in front of you today. Up until like 3 or 4 years ago, I was doing that. And so healthcare is, something I still really care about. And I think that there are methods of doing contact tracing that work and are community-based that don't, involve surveillance. So I think locally in Massachusetts, I don't think, what we're doing here in Massachusetts is perfect, but from what I understand, the contact tracing here locally is being led by, a public health institution, not a tech company. And they're calling people, and they're keeping, the identity of the person who tested positive anonymous. So, if you get a call because you've been in contact with that person, you don't actually know who the person was, versus like the much more, invasive kinds of surveillance where, tech companies want to push GPS tracking and all of these really horrifying things. So there are ways for us to, be safe without actually expanding this kind of like intrusive surveillance mechanism. And it really relies on, as always, community-based models, right? Of taking care of each other, of doing the right thing, like staying home if you are able to stay home, if you, are not an essential worker. So I think we definitely do not need the expanded surveillance that tech companies are pushing for.
Yes, I agree. Now we watch for our Now I've got another question. Couple more questions. We've been surprised by the number of Muslims who aren't familiar with CVE, including people who are impacted by the government surveillance, profiling, and overreach. Why do you think that is? Would anyone like to take that? Any thoughts, anybody?
I have thoughts, but I don't want to answer all of the questions.
Okay.
Ikraan, are you interested in answering that? I'm happy to take it if you.
Yeah. Never did lost the question.
Feel free to.
I think a big reason is it's secretive. The way that those first set of grants functioned in 2017, 2019, people who received CVE funding, they were not required to tell participants how they actually got money for these programs. So, on the surface, they could call the program whatever they want. And, for example, here in Boston, you might decide, that you want to send your kid to a training about online literacy, digital literacy, and not realize that they're going to tell your kid that, if Muslims start talking to you online, that you're a potential terrorist. Or you might send your Somali youth to after school program and not know that it's actually with the Boston Police Department and it's funded by Department of Homeland Security, and that the whole narrative behind the program is that your child is inherently dangerous. So, you know, it's on purpose. Like, they don't want us to know that it is CVE. And when we recognize it, that's when they change the name. So that's why you see, you know, TVTP and like all of these rebranding all the time, because when the community catches on, we, you know, resist and stand up against it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, other question, has there been, excuse me, research into the military industrial complex involvement in CVE and their goals behind it? Does anybody know anything about that?
This is Mary. I thought that was an interesting question, and I hadn't thought about that per se, but I do think that what CVE does is something that we've seen in our foreign policy as well, which is like the militarization of aid, basically. So money that might have been part of the federal budget that would have gone to community services is now essentially co-opted and you know, now involves law enforcement. And so when we've seen that with U.S. foreign policy aid as well. And so I don't know if that's exactly answering your question, but I think it's an important point to bring up. And as we said earlier, communities deserve services that do not involve funneling them toward law enforcement for no good reason. Everybody deserves the things in their communities that help them to thrive. And that includes schools, healthcare, you know, jobs, healthy food to eat. And we shouldn't have to, no community should, you know, as Fatima, this is so poignant. Every time I think about it, I just think it's so sad that the young people who you work with who said we shouldn't have to be seen as ticking time bombs to get services in our community. So that's my thought on that.
I can add to a really good resource on that question is The Muslims Are Coming by Arun Kanani. So he goes into how this is actually a counterinsurgency strategy, and it was, you know, from the get-go a counterinsurgency strategy. So highly recommend looking into that.
I've got one more question. I'm going to try to sort it out here. A question, are CVE indicators ground for charges themselves or just for arrest? And regarding the charges, when connections are made to, quote, terrorist organizations, what is actually happening? When the government publishes reports, they make these very definite claims, but I want to understand what actually happened behind the scenes. Any thoughts on that? I know when their report comes out, it sounds terrible usually. You find out what actually happened, usually not much, but.
Yeah, I can try to answer that. So I think with that question that it's confusing sort of two different things that can happen. So, you know, one thing that happens is the FBI shows up at your door, they try to get you to become an informant, or they entrap somebody over time through communicating to them. And, you know, that eventually leads to an arrest, which is sometimes, you know, often based on things that would have never happened. Mm-hmm. Versus when we're talking about CVE, we're not necessarily talking about people getting arrested, although that could happen, right? We're talking about training, you know, teachers, training mental health providers to criminalize people, to view them in a certain way, and then to say, hey, you need to go get de-radicalized, or you need to get help because you're on a path to violence. And that could sometimes lead to arrest. We, you know in the UK, it leads to these referrals to the government, and that database of everyone who was referred, you know, they said, oh, like we don't have a database. And then recently they said, actually, there is a database and all the police departments have access to it. We're not that far yet. But if you take the example of this kid, Ahmed, who built a clock and brought it to school, and then his teacher called the cops on him, right? That's what this leads to. Mm-hmm. Also, Mel, I think that there are questions separately in the Q&A that are not in the chat.
I'm not sure. I think people are passing them on to me.
Okay.
Here's another question. How can we, oh, do you have one you wanted to address?
Yeah, I can,
Okay.
I'll read the Q&A question
sure.
from
Okay.
Claire. She said, I've been trying to understand if when people are arrested and there are connections made to terrorist organizations, if they were entirely fabricated.
Oh, I see.
Oh, maybe that is the
Okay, I'm seeing what you're talking about.
question.
So this is my first
Oh,
Zoom. Okay, I see where you are. Yeah. Here's one other. How can we find out who or which organizations are CVE recipients in our communities?
This is Mary. I just put into the chat. I mean, one place to start is the Brennan Center report that has a list of all of the grant recipients from 2017. But as Fatima mentioned earlier, there are other revenue streams, and we've the best thing to do, honestly, is to FOIA, use the Freedom of Information Act, and try to. That's how we found out so much about what was going on in our community. And I just wanted to back on Sahar's questions, and hello, Sahar. You know, a couple of things that I can say, and these are, I think, more entrapment cases. And that was good that you distinguished between the two, Fatima. But like sometimes you can find out a lot of stuff by looking at court transcripts. And you know, you see that there's a lot of, and I think you mentioned this, maybe this is your webinar next week. Often mentally ill people are entrapped, and in that case, in those cases that I've read about anyway, they're often groomed to say certain things or do certain things by the FBI person, who can often even tell the parents that they're there to help the young person with their mental illnesses. So the cases can be really crazy. So in those things, they're somewhat fabricated. But then the other thing is the material support cases, which I know you know about, Melva. So if somebody made a donation to a charity that then is deemed as a terrorist organization, then they can use that as, that's highly politicized and racialized as well. So.
Yeah, the two definitely distinct types of cases. Yeah. Okay, I think we're about out of time. Are there? I think, but we answered all the questions, I think. I just want to let people know we have a news digest. If you want to stay in touch with us, send me an email to subscribe. You can send it to melva@civilfreedoms.org. And I want to thank all our panelists. You all were wonderful. You did a very informative and good program. And I hope everybody comes back next week. So until next Friday, we'll see you. Thanks again to everybody for